Well, good morning, and thanks for turning out this morning for the historical presentation by Mark Bergerman. You might be asking me, do I know this young man? Yes, I do. He's my son. So I have a great privilege to be his mom, and it's a blessing I count every day to be a mom. But Mark is here to share with you one of the topics that is near and dear to his heart. It's a passion of his, and it's the study of Ulysses S. Grant. And Mark wrote his thesis on it, and he's gonna share with you what really inspires him about Ulysses S. Grant and how he was not only a general and a president, but he was also a man. And he has a lot of information, so he'll be splitting it into two parts, this week and then next week. Okay. And Mark knows what I say to my family all the time on days like today, and that is to stay hydrated. So he has water out here, and he's going to stop when he needs to and take drinks of water, right? All right. Mom just had to make sure. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing? Doing good? Doing good? Well, before I get into the presentation, I'm going to give you a little bit of my background before him. Before I looked into the the in-depth humanity of Ulysses S. Grant, I never understood all the myths that surrounded him. And back in the time when I was a kid, when I first learned about him, I immediately had that spark in me to learn more about him. And the more I learned about him, the more I just said to myself, this probably to me is one of the greatest Americans I've ever read about. And one of these days, this day, I'm going to give you an example of why. The first part I love about him is when he was a general during one of our bloodiest wars, the American Civil War. And so, Ulysses S. Grant, from colonel, he was a colonel of the Illinois Regiment, to lieutenant general, is the greatest general in United States history. And this is not my opinion. Historians will back me up on the fact. Here's why. Historian Edward Bonnekamper described Grant's view of the war when he took command of all United States forces in March of 1864. The Union now had a general who had a broad national view of the war, something the Confederacy lacked, coordinated the activities of all theaters, and realized that destruction of Lee's army was a primary mission in the Virginia theater. The Confederate general was Robert E. Lee. Grant understood that to win the war for the United States and crush the rebellion, every Union army in the East and Western theater, as well as the Navy, had to coordinate together to ultimately defeat the quote-unquote invincible Confederate armies. But Grant already showed this kind of national strategy in the Western theater way before he went to command the United States forces fighting Robert E. Lee. And this is where I will get into the Western theater. Now, the Western theater of the Civil War was a vast expense. The rivers in that state, in mainly Tennessee and Mississippi, mainly the Mississippi River, were the interstate highways of the 19th century. Commerce went down the river, goods went down the river, etc., etc. So in early February of 1862, he developed a strategy to capture two Confederate forts along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, mainly Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Supplies and transportation went down these rivers way before war broke out in 1861. Not only did these rivers contain supplies for all Confederate forces, major Confederate armies covered these rivers and had more men than the Union had to conquer them. If you could capture these two forts, the Union could essentially plunge deep into Tennessee, into the heart of the Confederacy, force major Confederate armies to retreat, and essentially have the two rivers in Union control. Fort Henry would be the first, but his plan was to coordinate waterborne and overland troop movements with naval gunboats to capture Fort Henry on the Tennessee River. To capture the fort, Grant ordered one of his generals, General John McClernand, who he would have troubles with, unfortunately, during the time he was a political general. He would take a portion of his army and march from 3 miles north to come from behind and surprise the rumored reinforcements the Confederates received. He did this because of the fort's poor position on the river. And unfortunately today the fort is no longer existing because of the high water tides of the Tennessee River. But at the same time, the guns inside the fort still posed a threat because Union gunboats were sent to test it. On February 6th, the fleet began its bombardment of the fort. 54 guns outdueled the 17 heavy guns inside the flooded fort. The bombardment was so horrific in the aftermath that the 3,400 men garrison panicked and fled east toward Fort Donelson. And within 2 hours, the Confederate general there, Lloyd Tillman, hoisted the white flag of surrender. And the effects of this bombardment are horrific. Soldiers would talk about going into the fort and seeing arms, heads, and legs being protruded all over the fort. Grant's strategy worked, but he was disappointed because his soldiers had not intercepted the retreating Confederates. Nevertheless, Grant set out patrols and then decided the next step. And that next step would be Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. Grant then called a meeting of his commanders, C.F. Smith, Lew Wallace, and McClernand, who he hoped would agree to a cross-country march on Fort Donelson. But McClernand, on the other hand, was lobbying Washington for Grant's job. He was essentially an Illinois politician. He had really good connections with Abraham Lincoln, and he essentially wanted the job to command all the Western forces. He delayed the proceedings by reading a verbose declaration he pulled from his pocket, where Grant had no trouble ignoring him. Grant, however, had no orders from Henry W. Halleck, who was the main commander of the Western forces. Grant decided quickly ordered his troops to follow the retreating Confederates to Fort Donelson. This will come later on during the Vicksburg campaign, where he essentially did the same thing. But Grant, with this excessive style of offensive strategy to quickly defeat the Confederates with as few casualties as possible, is clear in a letter he wrote to his wife, Julia Dent Grant. Quote, "I want to push on as rapidly as possible to save hard fighting. These terrible battles are very good things to read about for persons who lose no friends. But I am decidedly in favor of having as little of it as possible. The way to avoid it is to push forward as vigorously as possible." As a result, the siege and Battle of Fort Donelson would begin on February 13th of 1862. Grant would receive reinforcements, but received orders from Halleck to not bring on a general engagement while those reinforcements came. While Grant waited, he coordinated with the River Navy to see if he could subdue Fort Donelson quickly like he did to Fort Henry. But this fort was really, really different and much more difficult than Fort Henry. The fort was entrenched on high ground, with more guns in it than Fort Henry. Grant knew this and created the strategy that ultimately captured the fort and the army in it. Again, Edward Bonnet-Kemper describes this. Despite Grant's orders, both Smith and McClernand sent some troops on senseless and unsuccessful assaults of the Confederate line. Meanwhile, in exchange of long-range fire between the ship and the fort's batteries, efforts that day were followed that night by the arrival of bitterly cold weather, including snow, sleet, and frozen rain. An Iowa soldier would describe how it was so cold in that part of Tennessee that they would run around in circles to keep warm and get from being frostbite. And a lot of his friends would suffer from hypothermia and suffer from freezing. Grant, in command of the Army of Fort Donelson, would later be renamed the Union Army of the Tennessee, named after the Tennessee River, not the state. We gotta differentiate that. It's the Tennessee River, not the state of Tennessee. On February 14th, another naval assault on the fort led to another failure due to the high ground of the fort and its batteries raking Union vessels. After the Navy's assault, Grant on February 15th rode out miles downriver to check on a Navy officer that was wounded in the assault the previous day. Unfortunately, he would die of his wounds a couple days later. The Confederate army at the fort took advantage of a lull to attack Grant's army. The Confederates successfully attacked from Donelson and pushed back McClernand's troops on Grant's right flank. Wallace eventually sent help from the center of Grant's line, and the Confederate attack was halted by 55 rounds of shot and shell from Wallace's guns. The Confederates had an opportunity to flee south toward Nashville away from Fort Donelson. Their hesitation, though, provided Grant with the opportunity to regroup and counterattack. And while Grant is attending to this Navy admiral, he hears the fighting going on, immediately gets back on his horse, and rode immediately to the scene after the fighting ended, calmly and coolly. And this is what I love about him. He was calm. He was collected. He did not let emotions get the better of him. And he eventually organized his forces commanders and took the initiative to win the battle. Initially, he was inclined to retrench, but when informed the enemy had an open escape route, he ordered the position and the Union right to be retaken. This would happen on the 16th of February, where his generals and soldiers would attack an exposed part of the Confederate line while McClernand and his soldiers regained the ground they lost the previous day. As a result, the Confederates' way to Nashville was cut off. The fighting around there was horrific, and I want you to imagine Grant going back to his childhood, because when he was a child, he was disgusted by the way his father worked at a tannery business. If you know what tanneries are, they basically separate animal hide skins. And you would see blood on the ground at these tanneries. And I could imagine him flashing back to his childhood, seeing the slaughter and gore and violence around him. He rode around the field and merely saw a wounded Union officer and Confederate soldier giving each other a drink of water. And Grant directed stretcher bearers to take them. And he said, "Take the Confederate too. The war is over between them." After riding and walking the battlefield and seeing the wounded, sometimes stepping through the blood-soaked snow, said to his aides, "Let's get away from this dreadful place." And those who claimed Grant was a butcher never seem to come across this quote. As the Confederates realized their doom, they asked for a surrender interview. Simon Boulevard Buckner, who used to be Grant's friend before the war, asked for lenient terms to the 15,000 men he commanded at the fort. But Grant, the war was not a game to him. He didn't appeal to the rosy compilations of, "Oh, you're my friend, let's talk it out." But he basically said, not playing games because of the reality of this war. Later wrote a letter to Buckner saying this: "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." Buckner, as a result, surrendered the fort and his 15,000 men. Grant's army during Fort Donelson, as a result, only suffered 2,331 casualties, while the Confederates suffered 13,846, plus 50,000 soldiers surrendering, which could be at a higher of a net loss of around maybe 19-20% for the Confederates, while Grant had a lower casualty rate. After the surrender of Fort Donelson, the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers were secure for the United States. As a result, its capture forced Albert Sidney Johnston, the commander of the Confederate armies in the region, to order a retreat from the major points along the river and in the state. Tennessee was completely cut in half. Grant immediately became a hero overnight. Newspapers praised him, politicians praised him, even Abraham Lincoln took notice of him. Because Union forces in the East were slow in their order offensive to take Richmond, Virginia, Abraham Lincoln made a direct order to all Union forces, especially in Virginia, to attack the Confederates as fast as possible. And if you know who George McClellan is, he obviously makes excuses and doesn't do that. These two victories were the first major victories for the United States in the second year of the war. As a result, one admirer sent Grant a box of cigars for his victory. And as a result, he would start smoking these cigars. But it led him to, he would smoke 20 cigars a day while he was general. 20. Americans noticed Grant's unconditional surrender letter, started calling him Unconditional Surrender Grant, or United States Grant, etc. But at the same time, Grant, sometimes due to a little bit of his humble nature, was like, "Yeah, I'm not a hero, I'm not buying this whole thing."
I think it's good.
After Fort Donelson, Grant moved down the Tennessee River to attack a new objective, under orders from Henry Halleck. This would be Corinth, Mississippi, in the northern part of the state. Major railroads intersected there that kept Confederate hopes alive through shipments, supplies, ammunition, food, clothing, etc. The Army of the Tennessee sailed down the river using steamboats and ironclads for faster transportation. They landed in southwestern Tennessee at a place called Pittsburgh Landing. Once they disembarked from the ship and started setting up camp throughout the area near the river, troops under William Tecumseh Sherman, who was rising through the ranks just as Grant was, would camp near a log Methodist church named Shiloh. Grant was under orders again, as at Fort Donelson, not to bring on a general engagement until reinforcements came from General Don Carlos Buell and his Army of the Ohio to join them. And as a result, take Corinth and drive into the heart of Mississippi. But Johnson, who commanded the Confederate Army of the Mississippi, heard of Grant encamping at the landing, as well as hearing about the reinforcements, created a strategy to destroy Grant's army before Buell got there. He would use the element of surprise to intend to trap Grant and his men against places such as Owl Creek and other marshes and demand them surrender. Johnson and his army would eventually reach the outskirts of Grant's camp despite rain and mud causing delays in the army. And Confederate soldiers would fire test shots in the air to see if they still worked. One Confederate general thought of this and said, they're probably giving away their position too much. And United States soldiers and Confederate soldiers would engage each other in skirmishes that bothered Union troops camped on the outskirts near the army, knowing that a Confederate army was right in front of them. But Grant dismissed them and said that Johnson did not have the capacity to order an offensive, which was a big, huge misstep on his part. There's no doubt about that. Sherman was of the same opinion and told his soldiers, especially one Ohio regiment, that they could go back to Ohio if they wanted to. Grant, on the evening of April 5th, would ride back to his headquarters miles upstream from the landing at Savannah, Tennessee, who was at the home of a Union supporter. The next day, a colonel in division named Everett Peabody, who was commanded by Benjamin Prentiss, knew that the Confederate skirmishing parties were not just skirmishers. And as a result, he sent on a pre-dawn patrol where they encountered the Confederates and battled with each other for half an hour until they retreated back to the camps to tell their friends and comrades, get ready. And there's a myth that goes around that Union soldiers were bayoneted and shot while they were sleeping. As I've shown you, that is a complete myth. That did not happen. Union soldiers were ready, and they knew the Confederates were out there. Intense and bloody fighting would last throughout the early morning with scenes of intense carnage. Union soldiers would hold for as long as they could, holding, counterattacking, and giving fierce resistance. Troops from Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Ohio, Indiana, and Missouri would fight fiercely at Shiloh Church under Sherman. The 53rd Ohio, as an example, battled with the 6th Mississippi and butchered 67% of the regiment of their fighting there from Sherman's camp. While the fighting was occurring, Grant was with his aides at Savannah having breakfast, when all of a sudden they heard the blast of cannon and rifle fire from the home. Grant realized that fighting had started. He got up from his chair and said to his aides, "Gentlemen, the ball's in motion. Let's be off." With his horse, he rode onto a transport, and immediately after the ship unleashed a ramp, rode hard onto the battlefield. He noticed that Union soldiers who retreated from the fighting were cowering beneath the bluff. Grant would order an Iowa regiment to gather as many soldiers as he could and form a defensive line to repulse the Confederate attack. Again, just like at Fort Donelson, he was cool, calm, and collected, and didn't let his emotions get the better of him. As a result, they would form a defensive line. Grant was cool and calm under fire, organizing his men to form that defensive line, not being affected by the bullets and shells around him. A little flashback to his childhood. While he was a child, his father would tell his neighbor to shoot a pistol near his ear to see if he could be reacted by it. And he said, "Flick it again, flick it again, flick it again." And he would fire it. He would not be fazed by it. And he would just be just completely calm. No hurry nature to him. While he was riding, though, a bullet or shell hit his sword scabbard, almost wounding him. Grant would write to Sherman to ask him the condition of his men. He noted that he took heavy casualties after the fierce fighting there. Grant told Sherman to hold as long as he could so he could get reinforcements to Shiloh in order to establish his line. Sherman told him that it would be costly, though, but he would hold. Sherman, along with the addition of John McClernand's soldiers, fought for 3 hours so that this line could be formed, counterattacking, holding, pushing the Confederates back. Just really intense back and forth fighting. Such units, such as the 20th Illinois and the 45th Illinois, suffered high casualties as a result. As the Confederate attackers were held on both left and right flank, the fighting started shifting toward the center at a place called the Hornet's Nest, where bullets flew so thick and fast that Confederate soldiers said it sounded like hornets. Mostly Illinois and Iowa farm boys held and repulsed fierce attacks and counterattack the Confederates to stop the most intense fighting of the Civil War. The 16th Wisconsin was also part of this fighting, did the same intense fighting as the men and boys from Illinois and Iowa did. Between repulsing of these assaults, Grant mentioned to the soldiers in the ranks saying, "Now boys, pitch in." Fighting, the Union boys held for 6 hours, giving Grant more time to establish his line. But the hornet nets eventually will be broken by 62 Confederate batteries, along with the surrender of Prentiss and his division, which was around 2,200 men. Confederates would attack Grant's last defensive line and be repulsed with heavy casualties. Johnson would be killed, and BGT Beauregard would take command of the Confederate Army. If any of you know about Civil War history, he essentially ordered the first shots to be fired at Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. Beauregard would send a telegram to Richmond claiming a great victory and said he could mop up Grant in the morning. But this is what he didn't realize. Grant does not retreat. He keeps moving forward. He doesn't give up. Though bloodied, Grant and his army survived to fight another day. Plus, during the night, Buell and his army started arriving and embarked at the landing and were set up in counter-offensive positions that Grant set up. Grant's strategy was to counterattack and gain the ground he lost the previous day. But Grant would obviously see the results of the fighting there at Shiloh. Along his lines, checking these soldiers, noticed the horrible sight that he described in his memoirs. "I moved back to the log house under the bank. This had been taken as a hospital, and all night wounded men were being brought in, their wounds dressed, a leg or arm amputated as the case might require. The sight was more unendurable than encountering the enemy's fire."